part of what I would like to discuss in this introduction is the thought of how reform of church, of society, and of each individual person really does have a lot to do with the humanistic call for a return to the sources, and that we'll see is what Erasmus was so eloquent in putting forward, and it captured the minds of many people at the time, and indeed helped to set the template for classical education in Europe, especially England, for until just a few decades ago, actually. And as the work of the Abigail Adams Institute is to provide supplemental humanistic education, this question is really at the heart of what we do as an institute. What is the Studia Humanitatis? What is the study of what it means to be human? What is humanistic pursuit? And that Erasmus is really one of the great people to go to try to understand this question of humanism, and then in particular Christian humanism. So part of what I would like to indicate as we discuss this wonderful little piece, the Sileni of Alcibiades, which is one of the entries in this massive work that he continued to work on for a long time, the adages, which were purported to be passages that he would pull from little tags that he would pull from the classical sources. This one he seems to have made up himself, though. That's interesting. And he had written this piece for publication in 1515. So this is right before his massive work on the New Testament was published in 1516, and that, of course, had its most wide-ranging and decisive effect in Luther's work, because Luther took up what Erasmus called the Novum Instrumentum. Instead of the New Testament, he called it the New Instrument. And it was the first time that the Greek text had appeared in print, because, as you know, it was just a few decades before, in the middle of the 1400s, that the printing press had been invented by Gutenberg, and that combined with movable type and paper revolutionized the production of books, and that is at the heart of the humanistic project, the massive expansion of literacy and of literature to meet that ability to read. So Erasmus put the Greek text of the New Testament in print in 1516, along with a revised translation of the Vulgate of Jerome, St. Jerome. And this caused a great scandal amongst conservative Catholics and was a breath of fresh air for people who really wanted to get close to the words that Christians consider holy. There were several translation decisions that were important that Erasmus made, including, instead of having repent be translated do penance, which would have been thought of as referring directly to the sacrament of confession, Erasmus was able to think more deeply about the conversion of soul that is involved in what Jesus proclaims there in metanoia. So we'll talk about that probably as the discussion goes on, but that decisive work on the New Testament fired Luther, his imagination, and Luther's own lectures on the letter of St. Paul to the Romans changed everything. And he was working in part from Erasmus's text. Erasmus was born, it's not quite clear when he was born, but we think in the late 1460s, probably 1469. He changed the date every once in a while himself. He was born to, it was an illegitimate child of a priest, and both of his parents died of the plague. And so he had the hard life of an orphan, and was put into a monastery by a guardian who did not want to assume that responsibility for very long. So he joined the Augustinians, just as Luther did. So we have in this pair, Erasmus and Luther, we have two Augustinian monks who both were ordained priests. Later on in his life, Erasmus, who had a very delicate physical constitution, he was released from monastic vows by the Pope. So he was always a priest, but he did not have to live the rigors of the supposed rigors of the monastic rhythm of life. He indeed lived most of his life as an independent scholar. He traveled Europe. He was a man of Europe. He was appointed one of the counselors of Prince Charles, who would later become Charles V, probably the premier Holy Roman Emperor, and the one who would preside over the whole question of the Reformation, and indeed over the Diet of Worms at which Luther made his stand. He became a counselor of Prince Charles in 1515, I think, and then had to live near Brussels, where the court was at the time. And he had to live near Louvain, with the Louvain theology faculty. So that faculty and then Paris would later be involved in the very unsavory task of heresy hunting and trying to condemn Erasmus, because again, his work on scripture especially was very disturbing to conservative Catholics. And it was said, there was that one of the funny lines that was said about Erasmus. What was it? Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. So as the Reformation caught fire in the German lands especially, and in Northern Europe in general, Catholics blamed Erasmus for having inspired Luther. And then radical reformers, including Luther, hated Erasmus for not siding with him in the great contest over the future of the church. So what Erasmus did was this very hard thing of being a moderate reformer. And I think that's a template that's worth our consideration. It is not a very easy path to take. Now, on the one hand, it's hard because both sides, the extremes, are going to hate you. The conservative reaction, which you can see, for instance, one of the moves at the Council of Trent, which was held from 1545 to 1563, was the institution of the Index of Forbidden Books, which is a great dark spot on the Catholic record. And I say that as a Catholic theologian myself. It is not humanist, and that's for sure. It was not a good thing. And indeed, in the first everything of Erasmus was put on the list. And he was considered one of the arch heretics. This does not do credit to the Catholic Church. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Luther hated Erasmus, thought him to be selling out all the more radical reformers, people more radical than Luther. Luther was trying to maintain a kind of middle ground of his own, but the more radical Protestants also, of course, hated Erasmus, even though many of them were, in fact, and maybe because many of them in their youth had been very much inspired by the humanistic project. So what is that project? Well, and I won't go into this, I've said it, some of this history before, that Petrarch had as a great classical scholar, had unearthed a lot of manuscripts, Latin manuscripts, and tried to present to the world the elegance of the classical Latin mind. Cicero was the great genius for the humanists. Coluccio Salutati in the late 1300s would institute this in Florence, in the Florentine Republic, as chancellor of the Republic. And he was meeting a crisis, that is the attempted Milanese the attempt of Milan to establish hegemony in northern Italy almost brought Florence down. But by a stroke of fortune or providence, the invading Visconti was killed, and he died, actually. He just died. And Florence was saved, but Salutati was wondering how in the world could the very survival of the state have been so precarious. And I think that's a question we all want to ask ourselves in this time in the American Republic. Things are very precarious, and the humanists want to answer the question, what would it take to make our republic sound again? And their answer was education. And that's my answer. I think that's the answer, I think, of the Abigail Adams Institute. And so that education was a humanistic education. That is a return to classical sources, a sense that the Middle Ages, which was a notion conjured up by Petrarch himself, the thought that there was once the glory of Greece and Rome, then the Gothic decadence of the medieval period, and then a renaissance, a new birth, a new way of thinking, which is going to draw from the past, the classical past, but do something new. And so that sense that Latin and then Greek, that the study of Greek was a way of putting together the two halves of the Roman Empire, which had fallen apart. And indeed, you know that in the previous decades, again, not only was the printing press developed in the middle 1400s, but the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, fell in 1453. So this was a massive it was a shock to the mind of Europe. Obviously, the Ottoman Turks were on the rise, and they would continue to harry and press Europe for centuries afterwards. Actually, that was one of the reasons that Charles V, as Holy Roman Emperor, couldn't really concentrate on dealing with the Reformation, is because he had to deal with the Ottoman Turks. So these were very decisive things in the middle of the 1400s that were in place. And at that time, as that century went on and the voyages of discovery were happening and the new world was opening up, the humanists were taking up this notion of salutati, of civic humanism, the thought that we are in a period of crisis, we're in a period of new possibilities, and we need to think more deeply about what it means to be human. And that was what the humanistic study was about, was what does it mean to be human? And that's what Erasmus, really premier amongst the great, as they say, the prince of the humanists, he through his prodigious scholarship and writing and his own personal example, he put this moderate path of reform, of social transformation and renewal in front of the mind of Europe. Again, that affected education. It also, I think, laid the groundwork for, in various ways, in various unique ways that are not direct lines, but his spirit can be seen in the Enlightenment. It can be seen in the Romantics. It can be seen in the Idealists. I do think that with Erasmus, you have a lot of the great seedbed of later European thought. So one thing I would like us to think about as a community who are committed to this conversation about how should we live, what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to live well? Does the humanistic ideal of beautiful language, that was one of the things they cared about. That was always deeply in their hearts. And along with the liberal arts that still survived in the Middle Ages, they added poetry and history. They emphasized ethics and rhetoric. And so this was a kind of a new formulation of the liberal arts. And we would like to look and see how in the history of philosophy since then, we've seen what has been called the primacy of the practical. Kant was one of the ones who waved that flag. Certainly Emmanuel Levinas, another great thinker who's identified with that. The notion that ethics is more important than metaphysics. Well, that's already there in the humanists, and it's certainly there with Erasmus. So that's one thing for us to consider is, was that good or bad? Erasmus talked about a philosophy of Christ, the Philosophia Christi, and that was his notion. And part of that is a challenge to the traditional theological monopoly on power, theological monopoly on knowledge that was still present at the time, and still, I think, in a way, a dominant paradigm in the Catholic world still. And I say that as a theologian, but that monopoly has to be broken, because there's the necessity of being exposed to what is best of what has been thought and said it's just essential for being human and to do it well. So part of what is on the table for us as citizens of a republic that's in crisis right now is, do we think humanistic education is actually going to have enough weight to matter in this time? Does the way we use language matter? I was having a great conversation with Katerina on the car ride over Kansas, that could it be that humanism could be open to a multicultural kind of approach where not just the Latin and the Greek, but any novel way of experiencing the world that has an organic kind of force? Shouldn't we listen to that and be moved by something that is interesting, that is different from what's ready-made, commercial? Part of the problem is that our language is become very utilitarian. One of the concerns humanists had when they looked at people like Aquinas, who's just a brilliant thinker, but the language itself is it's utilitarian. There isn't a beauty except when he was writing his poetry. But unlike Cicero or Augustine, where the language itself is very beautiful, we tend to, even our authors, our literary authors, don't tend to write very interesting prose. And for a humanist, that's a catastrophe for the human mind. And I would like to argue that they're right about that interesting words come from interesting thinking. And if we don't have interesting words or beautiful words, we don't have the same kind of thinking going on. It doesn't help us. It causes us to be stifled in our approach. So let's see if there's something else I want to get to here. As I put a lot on the table. Part of it is the question of Europe and the West. By bringing back the Greek authors, I think the humanists remind us that the West was never really just the West. I mean, Greece is itself the crossroads of West and East. That was always the case. So if you say Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, if you say the Roman ideal is in fact the Europeans always thought of themselves as Romans, it's not a Western thing, really. That would be to reduce it to the Western Roman Empire. It's the thought that the human has somehow become very luminous in this axis of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. And I would recommend whatever you call it the West, call it Europe, call it just human excellence. This openness to the great traditions of both East and West is something that's going to be essential to living a life that is worth living. All right, I think I probably put enough on the table. The questions that are proposed, number one, is the most significant part of something the most hidden? How do prevalent patterns of trauma hide themselves? How does goodness hide itself? A little bit of a leading question there, but I think I'm very moved by this notion of the Silenus that is the dominant image of this essay, and I think it can be very fruitfully applied to very pressing issues of our own personal lives. Number two, are there societal values contrary to human flourishing that determine the paths we choose in life? Are those who are religious immune to worldliness? And again, a lot of what Erasmus is doing in this essay is hammering the worldliness of the hierarchical the clerics of the Catholic Church. And I think for those of us who are Catholic and are concerned about reform, this is still timely. In fact, it's more timely than ever. What does it take to actually reform an institution that has lost its way? Number three, are Erasmus's anti-theocratic or anti-integralist arguments still relevant? That's a leading question. And number four, does elitism, especially combined with how he frames the two worlds in conflict in this world, complicate the reform potential of Erasmus's analysis? And that's a reference to page 58 in particular. But one last thought before I leave off here, and hopefully have stimulated some thoughts that will lead to a lively discussion. I do think that in a way Erasmus, I think, has a weakness as far as elitism, and that was humanism tended to become an elite marker, at least for the new mercantile classes that wanted to establish themselves as having a kind of nobility without being part of the old nobility. Dante, and that was part of what Petrarch was doing by going behind Dante when he tried to get back Latin, when in fact Dante had already started to open the path towards a vernacular movement, and that was, of course, very democratic. And I think a Dantean humanism would probably be the way to go. So that's just another suggestion.